students know anything about me, they know this thing, which is when I lived in a cage with Guillermo España. Because a lot of students have seen this video documentary that we did called The Couple in the Cage. And it's kind of, I feel a little weird about this project at this point, because next year is going to be 20 years. And I'm kind of tired of it, in a way. And I also get asked about it all the time. And I'm just kind of like, will I ever get out of that cage? Did I have any idea when I got in there? And so I'll just say a few things, and then move on. One is that it was a totally transformative experience for me. I don't think I really understood what my involvement with art was until I did this piece with Guillermo. I didn't understand how powerful something could be that you can't even control what's happening when you're trying to make it and you're making it in front of people. And so it was scary, and it was exciting, and it was exhausting, and it was in some ways really terrifying, and it marked me in this way because that I don't know if anything else I've ever done did, because it became identified with me and with Guillermo and with us as people, not just as artists. We are the people from the cage. But also because we had this crazy idea, okay? It was going to be the quincentenary. Believe it or not, 20 years ago, that was a big deal. Whoa, let's go dump on Columbus. Okay, it was a different era. Probably there are a lot of you like, why did you care? Well, I mean, one reason to care was that the U.S. government was spending like gazillion dollars on celebrating the Columbus 500th anniversary of the so-called discovery. And also in Europe, they were spending lots and lots of money. And there were a lot of people at the time that thought that was wrong and were offended by it and wanted to use the celebration as an opportunity to organize protest. Okay? And so we were asked to participate in these art events in Europe that were going to take place in Spain and England. Just happened to be the two countries that did the most colonizing in this part of the world. And we wanted to kind of take advantage, and the festival was this festival that no longer exists anymore, but it was supposed to be about revitalizing underutilized urban spaces and kind of working with sight, right? And so we were like, well, we need to attack this, right? And we had been reading accounts of indigenous peoples that went in the other direction, that went to Europe, were taken to Europe as kind of war trophies, things like that. And Guillermo had written a poem about, imagine what if, instead of Columbus coming, it was some Aztec Indian who, named, Eudoxin, right? And then he went to travel to this other continent and gave it his name. And so, and at one point I was reading this book by Sandra Gilman called Difference in Pathology, and one of the chapters begins with this account of these Ashanti women who were put on display in a park in Vienna and were asked to defecate in public to prove how savage they were. And, I just remember being completely, utterly, blown away by this. And so we said, well, what if we, did a kind of satirical take on this whole history? But we did not, the idea was not to be taken seriously, the idea was to make a satire. And then we got to our test run at UC Irvine, and even before we got there, we had to send a list of props that we wanted, and we asked for a bedpan because we didn't know how we were going to resolve the going to the bathroom thing. And then not the teachers who were at the school, but the people who handle kind of health and safety issues got a hold of the memo with our list, and they thought that we were anthropologists who were bringing quote-unquote real savages, and they started sending warnings that we couldn't defecate in a gallery at school, that was a health risk, that they had Xeroxed from like medical manuals about the diseases that so-called in rural peoples of the world, which is like a code word for people of color from the third world, the diseases that they carry, right? So we're reading all this stuff and going, this is really unbelievable. And so we like made these gigantic posters with all the memos and put them all up. But it was the beginning of something where we kind of, slowly started to realize that we had touched a nerve and that people were going to react the way they were going to react, and it didn't really matter what we did. I mean, I had no training as a dancer. I didn't know any indigenous dances. I would just like hop around and look really ridiculous, and people would applaud, and like, and Guillermo was like talking gibberish, and people would applaud and think that it was some indigenous language. I mean, it just didn't matter what we did, as long as we had the framing, right? And so, and then there were, not everybody, but there were those people when we started the tour who believed it in one way or another for one period of time or another. And that was just what happened. And, some of it I think has to do with the power of certain kinds of cultural institutions to convince people that what they have is what they say they have. So you walk into a natural history museum, if they say that this rock is, this kind of rock, and it's 5 billion years old, you're probably going to believe it. And the same thing, if you walk into that same natural history museum and you see two people in a cage and they say that they're these people from this island, some people took it seriously. So, there isn't too much more to it than that in terms of it's just about the power of certain institutions and certain contexts to frame what we do as artists. And that's kind of what I learned. And then also, all the stuff that we all carry around in our heads, whether we want to believe it or not, that comes out when you think that people in front of you don't understand what you're saying. And so since the docents kept saying that we didn't understand any Western language, some people took it upon themselves to say a lot of things in front of us. So, and to do a lot of things in front of us that were sort of weird. So that was that, and we did this for 2 years, and we ended up, this was the last version of the tour in Buenos Aires, which was a very different kind of context in which seeing people in a cage was read much more through the historical filter of the military dictatorship and the dirty war and the attacks on the left and the disappearance and all the political prisoners that they had had. And so the trauma, the kind of trauma that was revisited by our being there in a cage had more to do with that specific situation. I have to ask, is it possible to get that light out of my eyes?